On behalf of ARUP Laboratories and its Institute for Learning, we're pleased to provide you with this video lecture entitled A Hippocratic Oath for the Diagnostic Industry, presented by Dr. Brian Jackson. Dr. Jackson directs the Informatics Department at ARUP, including ARUP's consult, decision support, product management, and utilization management. He is also the medical director for referral testing and an associate professor of pathology at the University of Utah. He received his bachelor's degree in mathematics, his master's degree in medical informatics, and his medical degree all from the University of Utah. He completed his clinical pathology residency at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. Dr. Jackson's research interests include economic analysis of diagnostic testing and physician utilization of laboratory tests. He is certified in clinical pathology by the American Board of Pathology. I'll now turn our video lecture over to Dr. Jackson.
All right, thanks, Cherie. Hello to everyone, and thank you very much for participating in the webinar today. I'm really excited to be speaking on this topic. It's a topic that has intrigued me deeply over the past few years, and it's a topic that I think has growing importance in the healthcare space. I hope that it's a topic that gets increased discussion over the next few years. So I'm going to start a little bit lighthearted with a quote that I think most people will remember from a few years ago. Corporations are people, my friend. You don't need to worry. I'm not going to talk about any of the politics of this, but I'm using the quote because if you look at it through an objective lens, you see a really interesting philosophical question here. And the question has to do with, are there ways in which we would want to treat corporations analogous to how we treat people? Let me be a little bit more specific. The way that we treat each other in society, a lot of it comes down to rights and responsibilities. We have rights and responsibilities which codify the expectations that we have for each other within our society, and that forms the basis of the legal structure, but it also forms the basis of a number of other social institutions. Do corporations have rights? Do corporations have responsibilities? Now, the first of these questions is a really hot legal topic right now, and I'm not going to touch it. This is a number of Supreme Court cases over the past couple of years have dealt with this question, and this is not in the scope of my talk today. But the second question has not, in my opinion, had nearly enough discussion, which is the responsibilities of corporations. As a society, do we expect corporations to care about anything beyond making money? And do we hold them accountable to anything beyond making money? It's a really fundamental question. Economists have argued about this one. But particularly in the healthcare space, I think this is a topic that we need to wrestle with. So to be really specific here, the questions I'm going to cover in my presentation, number one, why would healthcare corporations need to be held accountable to medical and scientific ethics? Think about this for a minute. We know we hold doctors accountable. And frankly, all medical professionals at some level, lab techs, nurses, all of us in the healthcare space, at a personal level, we know we get held accountable for putting the patient first and doing the right thing. So why would it be important to separately hold the larger organization accountable? That's what I'm going to try and get to today. Second question is, how can this be done, assuming that it can be done? And then the third question that I will try to address along the way would be to provide specific examples to make this relevant in the laboratory industry. Let's start with the first question, which is, do healthcare corporations face ethical challenges? It may sound like a rhetorical question to some of you, but we need to start here. And by corporations, I basically mean any large organization involved in healthcare. So that could be a pharma, it could be a device company, it could be a hospital or healthcare system, it could certainly be a laboratory or an IVD vendor. Let me give some examples of ethical questions which arise in the healthcare corporate space. Some of you will remember the Vioxx scandal of a few years ago. Let me recap this. Vioxx was a hugely profitable analgesic. It was about $2.5 billion in 2003 alone. This is huge, just from one single drug. It went through all of the appropriate FDA approvals and clinical trials and all of that. So it got onto the market. And then in 2000, there was a large study that was published which suggested some serious cardiac risks. And at this point, Merck had to decide internally what it was going to do with that study. And this is where the ethical question comes up. There was an accusation in the New England Journal of Medicine that Merck suppressed some of the data in this study. Whether they did or not, what's clear is that Merck continued in their sales and marketing efforts to downplay the study. You could cynically use the word spin if you want to, but I do need to be careful here and acknowledge that I'm not in a position to pass judgment on Merck or its individuals running the company as to whether they acted ethically or not. The point I'm trying to make is that the decisions they made had ethical consequences. And so as a society, we would hope that large corporations facing these questions would view them through a strong ethical lens. So basically, from 2000 to 2004, Merck continued in their sales and marketing efforts to encourage doctors to use the drug to suggest that it's actually pretty safe. And then in 2004, another study came out which confirmed the original suggestions of cardiac risk, and at that point, it was taken off the market. It's estimated that there were 27,000 myocardial infarctions and sudden cardiac death cases that were attributable to use of this particular drug. That's huge patient impact, obviously. My summary point here is that the decisions, in this case, the sales and marketing decisions of large healthcare corporations, have big impact on patients. And so we would want executives and other decision makers to be making these decisions from the same Hippocratic oath tradition as doctors use in making decisions about individual patient care. Here's a second example, different industry. This is from the medical device industry. And I'm referring here to a hip implant device that was in the news a lot a couple years ago. It was a metal-on-metal design. It sounded great in principle. Again, went through all the appropriate FDA approval to get onto the market. So everything up to that point was fine. But once it began to be used in routine clinical practice, there began to be reports of failure rates. And some surgeons suggested that there might be a higher failure rate with this device than with other devices. So basically, concerns were raised. An artificial hip is something that should normally last about 20 years. And some of these devices were needing to be replaced after a couple of years. And so the data coming in a situation like this is never 100% clear. It requires scientific interpretation. But my point again is that when those reports started coming in, this company had a decision to make as to how to handle that data. They could have made the decision in such a way as to share these reports broadly, let surgeons know that they were getting reports of device failures, request more feedback, et cetera, et cetera. What the company appears, as best I can tell, to have done is to continue to use their sales and marketing channels to suggest that the device was very safe and that if there were any problems with it, that it was really the surgeon's fault. Again, I don't know all the facts here, and if I misrepresent anything, I apologize, but this is sort of my interpretation of what I read in the news stories on this one. There were about 93,000 patients who received this device, and there was an estimate I saw of about a 13% failure rate. So that's about 10,000 patients that were negatively affected or appear to have been negatively affected by this. And again, the business decisions of the company had an impact on that. And it's a reason why you would hope that a company in this situation would make its business decisions through a lens of the Hippocratic tradition of putting the patient first. Okay, so here's a very different example. This is of a hospital chain in the Southeast. This was a for-profit hospital chain. I believe it's currently in the process of being acquired by another chain. And as I understand it from the news report, which I've cited here, this hospital appears to have figured out in its finance department that if their admission rates through the emergency room went up, that they made more money. Now, this actually makes sense when you think about it. Doctors in the emergency room have a judgment call to make. Does a patient need to be admitted or not? The sickest patients will always get admitted. The healthiest patients will always go home, but it's in the middle area where there's a judgment call. And if your emergency room doctor tends to make those judgment calls in favor of more admissions, then you end up admitting more low acuity patients who are relatively easy to discharge, and the hospital can make more money off of them because there are fewer complications. So all that's understood, but the hospital's actions are interesting here. They chose to develop a report card for their physicians that showed them their admission rates and actually tagged them as red, yellow, or green, depending on how high they were. And not only that, according to the news article, doctors were actually fired if they had too few admissions compared to their peers. And not only that, but there was a report of at least one administrator who thought this was wrong and refused to go along with it. And so she got fired for refusing to cooperate. So in my book, if I believe what was in the news story, this sounds incredibly unethical. Again, is an example of why it's not just the actions of doctors that count in today's world. It's the actions and decisions of corporate executives that have an impact on patients, and we need to hold them accountable to the same principles. I wanted to provide at least one lab example. This one's a little bit of a different one, but I think it applies. It has to do with patents on DNA sequences. So hopefully this is going to be less of a problem in the future, thanks to the Supreme Court decision a little while ago. But for a long time, there were certain laboratories in the United States that held patents on certain genetic tests. And what the effect that that had was that by limiting access, they were able to make more money, is the bottom line. I doubt that the laboratories would characterize it that way, but that's the economic effect when access is limited, is that prices tend to be higher. So this is an example of where the decision to restrict access to a particular test is a business decision. Even though I acknowledge that some of the laboratories say that they were making this for quality considerations, I suspect that this decision was often made, in certain cases at least, for business reasons. That impacts patients in terms of availability of certain things. And so that's why I think this makes this an ethical issue as well. So the point I just tried to make is that executives at corporations make business decisions that impact patients, and therefore there are ethical issues at play here. The second question I want to address is, how relevant is this? Do healthcare corporations play a big role in the delivery of healthcare or a small role? If healthcare corporations are only a small part of the picture, then maybe this isn't such a big deal. But I actually believe that large corporations are playing a pretty large role in things that impact patients, and that role is actually increasing as well. So this picture, purely for illustration, shows healthcare then and now. The then picture on the left-hand side is a very old picture, I don't know, maybe 70 years old. I just found it on the internet. What appears to be a house call of a family physician. 70 years ago or longer, the quality of healthcare was mainly determined by the individual physician. And the patient experience was mainly determined by the individual physician. Sure, we had hospitals back then. We had a few medications, a few lab tests, but maybe 90% of what happened to the patient with regard to their healthcare was dependent on that individual doctor-patient relationship. Today's a bit different. I'm showing a picture of my own university hospital, the University of Utah Medical Center. I'm very proud of this organization. It's a great organization. But I'm using the picture to illustrate that healthcare has become much bigger. It's much more high-tech. It's much more organizationally complex. With all of these expensive technologies and processes and tools and things that we have in healthcare today, it's natural that large organizations, including large corporations, are playing a much bigger role in the delivery of healthcare. It's a natural trend. Doctors are still relevant, but doctors are not 90% of the picture anymore. I'd say maybe doctors are 50% of the picture or 60%. But large organizations are being a bigger part of the picture. We need to apply the same set of expectations and accountabilities that we traditionally applied to doctors. This is the point I just made. In the old days, quality of care was mainly dependent on doctors. Today, it's increasingly determined and influenced by the decisions and actions of large corporations. Now, as an aside, I hope none of you are thinking, this is this granola munching socialist talking who hates corporations, who thinks we should go back to the old days. I don't mean to imply any of that. I think that technology is great. I think that large corporations and other organizations in healthcare have huge potential to do great things. I just want to see the balance be correct in terms of our social expectations and how we apply them. So the point I'm trying to make in this slide is that not only are large organizations, including corporations, a large part of healthcare, they're actually getting larger. Hospital systems have been consolidating over the past decade. Physician groups, in many cases, getting acquired by hospital systems, but if not getting acquired, then generally growing in size and consolidating. See the same thing happen with health insurers, pharma, medical device companies, et cetera. The risk in this situation is that as companies get bigger, there's a natural risk that they can behave in less personal ways, be less attuned to the needs of the individual patient or the ethics of interacting with an individual patient. So again, it's an argument for why we need mechanisms to prevent that from happening. Because we're not going to prevent these trends. We're going to have large organizations no matter what. So the challenge here is we hold doctors and scientists accountable to medical ethics, but do we or can we hold organizations, and particularly large healthcare corporations, accountable to those same ethical principles? If so, how can we do that? Before I go on, I need to do a little bit of defining. I keep talking about ethical principles, but I haven't said what I think those are. So let me just, without going into great detail, let me just list a high-level overview of what I'm talking about. In my opinion, the most relevant top-level categories of ethics in healthcare fall into two main buckets. One is the medical ethical tradition, and the other is the scientific / academic educational kind of ethical tradition. Medical ethics are actually very well codified. There's a whole academic literature on this. The general framework for this places the issues into four categories. Autonomy is the patient's right to choose what happens to their own body. Non-maleficence is a synonym for do no harm. Beneficence means to do good, which sounds obvious, but it basically means that everything we do in healthcare should have a reasonable expectation of benefiting the patient. You shouldn't do things like give them vitamins that you know aren't going to do any good just to make money. Everything has to have legitimate expectation of medical benefit. And then justice gets into distributional things like affordability and fairness and things like that. Scientific ethics is coming from the academic tradition and has strong emphasis on things like transparency, openness, objectivity, lack of spin, and an overall goal of general advancement of knowledge. And all of us in healthcare, whether we're at an academic center or not, are part of this scientific tradition and should be considering ourselves subject to those goals as well. So the question is, if these are our goals as individuals in the healthcare space, how do corporations stack up against that? And unfortunately, not always really well. I gave some examples at the beginning that may have been violations of ethics, though I'm not saying they necessarily were. But in a general sense, I think most of us would agree that large companies take liberties with pretty much everything on this list, whether it's an insurance company narrowing the choice of providers and limiting autonomy in order to get negotiating leverage, or a device company cutting corners on safety, or a pharma violating the beneficence principle by marketing a Me Too drug that's not any better than the cheaper generic that's already available, on and on and on. So many examples of this. I think most of you will agree that problems occur. The question becomes then, if you agree that this is a problem, is it a fixable problem? And this is a harder question. And I suspect that some people in the audience may be listening to this and think, yeah, that's a really idealistic perspective, but you can't fix this. I actually think we can fix this. And that's what I'm going to try and lay out in the rest of my presentation. For the cynics in the audience, and if there are any of you that lean libertarian or suspect I'm acting like a socialist here, this is sort of a key question. Why would a for-profit company, or why should a for-profit company care about anything other than short-term profits? This is actually a deep philosophical question in the business world. It's been debated intensely. For example, Milton Friedman around 1970, a famous economist, came out and said definitively corporations should only care about profits. But I'll tell you, the academic business literature has been swinging back the other way over the last decade. And I'm going to lay out some of the arguments that are coming out, again, from the academic business literature. It's all driven by this general phenomenon. Long-term sustainability is dependent on stakeholder partnerships. Well, that sounds really abstract, and it is. But But the basic principle here is if you're running a company, just think of any company you might want to run, maybe a little retail store or or who knows what. If you're running a company and all you care about is the short term, then you can act unethically and get away with it for a while and probably make more money by acting unethically, whether it's cheating your customers or cutting corners on regulations or who knows what. But you're not going to get away with it for a long time. The longer term your outlook is, the more that you need to keep your actions in accord with general society, because your stakeholders over the long run will hold you accountable. This is still pretty abstract. Let me try and illustrate a little bit more. So if you're a corporation, which is the circle in the middle of the slide, who are your main stakeholder groups? Your owner, if it's a single owner, or your shareholders, if you're, say, a publicly traded company, are clearly a very important stakeholder group. And I've put them in the upper left-hand corner. And you have obligations to them. You have transparency obligations, and you have an obligation to make money for them, because that's, in most cases, money is the expectation and the reason for owning a portion of a company. So that's one stakeholder group. And if that were the only stakeholder group for a company, then yeah, it would only be about making money. But in fact, any corporation that's organized for the long haul has to take its other stakeholders really seriously. Customers are an obvious stakeholder group. If you cut costs by cutting corners on quality and selling a shoddy product, you might be able to boost your profits in the short run, but you'll lose all your customers in the long run. You'll go out of business. Your workforce is an important stakeholder group, your employees. The simple example here would be if you don't have a good working environment, if you don't treat them fairly and they don't believe they're being treated fairly as employees, then again, you can get away with it over a short run, but you're not going to get away with it over the long run, because it will bite you, because your best employees will leave and find jobs elsewhere. And your worst employees will lower their quality even further. So treat your workforce not just as a commodity, but as a stakeholder in any organization. The local community. A simple example of that would be toxic waste. If you're a hospital and this is obviously extreme. As a hospital, you could save money in the short run. Instead of paying for expensive biologic waste disposal, just dump it in the gutter outside your hospital. Obviously, even if you save money in the short run, it wouldn't last very long, because the local community would shut you down, and your CEO would lose his or her job over that. Government is really an extension of that phenomenon and gets into the regulatory issues. So again, any corporation, any organization, frankly, that's in it for the long haul needs to take its stakeholder groups very seriously and think about its accountability to different stakeholder groups. And those accountabilities are different for the different groups. Shareholders, it's largely about money, but for the other stakeholder groups, it's about non-financial. That's the point I'm making here. Now, financial accountability is the most straightforward of these to enforce. We have very standardized ways of measuring financial accountability. We have profits, we have revenue, we have accounting standards that force you to report these out in very transparent, standardized ways. But non-financial measures are a bit fuzzier, and this is where the interesting challenges come. But it's not impossible to deal with this area. So this is what I'm going to lay out over my next few slides. Question of how can these other stakeholders, particularly society as a large, which I'm representing as local community, hold corporations accountable for non-financial things? And here's a sort of a simple process for how this can happen. For a company to behave in ethical ways, which is another way of saying in ways that meet the social expectations of the larger community and a healthcare organization, the needs of patients in particular, it all has to start with being an internal priority. If the company doesn't really care about these things, none of this other stuff is going to happen. So it has to start with being a strong internal priority. The second principle here is transparency. You have to have strong transparency to both your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. Third principle is external accreditation. We in the lab industry know a lot about accreditation processes, and accrediting organizations play a really important role in keeping us honest, but also in creating a level of trust that what we're transparent about is real and not just paying lip service. The next principle is a big one, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this one. It has to do with the supply chain. If you're the CEO of a company, you can set the agenda and you can make sure your organization behaves ethically and in accord with Hippocratic oath type of principles. But your supply chain gives you a mechanism where you can hold other corporations accountable, namely the ones that you're doing business with, because every corporation does business with a lot of other corporations. So this is the way that the organizational community, or the business community, if you want to think of it in business terms, can act to hold each other accountable to these same kinds of principles. And it's a really powerful and underused mechanism in healthcare. And then the last principle is regulatory. And the point that I'll make about regulatory, this would, in our world, it includes CLIA, effectively CMS and their rules, certainly includes the FDA. The point I'm going to make here is that regulatory mechanisms are unique in this mix, in that they have the power of law behind them. So in some sense, it's a very powerful mechanism, but it's not one that can replace the need for these other pieces. And in an ideal world, it's one that is complementary to these other pieces. But I'll illustrate that a little bit more as we go on. Okay, let me give some examples of corporations making non-financial, ethical considerations a strong internal priority. Everyone's familiar with Nike. Some of you may be wearing Nikes as you listen to this presentation. A few years ago, you may recall in the news, Nike took a lot of heat by being accused of using sweatshop labor to manufacture its products. This was not unique to Nike. Frankly, most companies in the garment industry and in the shoe industry use a lot of labor from Southeast Asia, and we know that factories in those places don't always have worker standards that are equal to what we have in the US or Europe. But what's important about this story is that Nike took that criticism really seriously, and they made some changes at their top level to address this. In particular, they brought someone onto their board of directors. If I'm remembering correctly, it was the president of a major liberal arts college, who in some sense functioned as a source of internal conscience, or increased internal conscience, to balance some of the business interests and to get discussed at the board of directors level. And they also created a corporate responsible and sustainability committee as a committee of the board of directors. I don't believe most for-profit companies have something like that. Does any of this guarantee that Nike is going to not use sweatshop labor? Does it guarantee that Nike will do things to address workers' rights? No, it doesn't guarantee it, but it's an essential first step. And if Nike didn't do any of this, then you can pretty much guarantee that it wouldn't make progress in those other areas. So I think it's remarkable and noteworthy that Nike did this. Here's from a different industry. This is from the industrial chemical industry. So not clinical chemistry, but rather industrial chemistry, like plastics companies and so forth. This industry has a really big impact on the environment. It uses a lot of fossil fuels, and there are a lot of pollution questions that come out of this particular industry. And so a number of big companies in international industrial chemicals got together and put together a charter that they call Responsible Care. You can see the specific topics in here on this next slide. I just magnified it a little bit. And a number of large industrial chemical companies have signed their names to this charter, which basically says that they will adhere to a number of principles. Again, has a big emphasis on environmental sustainability. Again, is it guaranteed that a company who signs this is going to pollute less? Well, no. No, there's no guarantee there. But it is a first step. And it's a step, by signing a charter like this, a company is really putting themselves out there and essentially inviting consumers to hold them accountable. Here at AREP Laboratories, I wanted to give a lab example here. Here at our own organization, we have something that we call the five pillars, and it's our internal code of ethics for our workforce. And as you would expect, it starts off with putting the patient first, that everything that we do needs to be first and foremost about the patient, and the code of ethics says you don't cut corners and put any of that at risk. There's a lot more detail to this, but I just throw it out there. I expect that most of your organizations probably have analogous codes of ethics for your employees. But if you don't, and if you haven't put it into a document like this that you can distribute and talk about, I would really strongly encourage that. It's an important first step in this process. Okay, next step, transparency. This plays out in a couple different ways. So let me give some different examples here of transparency. Some of you on the call might be at Dignity Health facilities. I don't know that for certain, but in any case, something that really impresses me about Dignity Health is that the organization has an annual report that is social responsibility report for the public, and it includes environmental responsibility, things like carbon footprint. It includes employee diversity efforts. It's a natural place to include their scores on different medical quality scorecards. So issuing an annual report like this, where you present your numbers out to all of your interested stakeholders, is an important form of transparency. Now, as more organizations get into this, doing annual reports and reporting these kinds of things, it becomes important that we report them in standardized ways, because otherwise the readers of the reports won't necessarily trust our numbers. Just like with financial accountability, if someone says they've got a 20% profit margin, you want to make sure they're measuring their profits by the same formula that you use in your own organization, and they're not fudging the numbers in some way. So in the financial world, we have something called FASB, or the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which is part of federal law. Well, it's an independent group, but their standards effectively have the force of law behind them and require us to report financial numbers in highly standardized ways. So a Harvard Business School professor a couple of years ago looked at the growing trend of reporting non-financial data, such as carbon footprint or workers' rights or things like that, and said, hey, we need some standards around that if this transparency is going to be trusted. And so SASB was formed, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. It's still a very new initiative, but it's an intriguing one to keep an eye on. And they're producing standards for reporting these kinds of measures to make them more trustworthy. There's another aspect to transparency that I want to give a couple examples of, and it has to do with scientific transparency. Within the healthcare world, we're part of the scientific academic tradition. And I believe it's an important ethical principle that we think of ourselves as scientists and that companies think of themselves as scientific companies. So here's an interesting example. It's sort of a unique example. Medtronic is a really big medical device company. Most of you will have heard of them. And a few years ago, they came out with a spinal surgery device for bone grafting that included a new recombinant hormone. And the hormone was a bone growth hormone. And so the idea was that it would promote faster healing. And so in principle, it sounded like a really great thing, and surgeons were very, very excited about this when it came out. It obviously had to go through the full FDA approval process. And so they had to do clinical trials and so forth to convince the reviewers of the FDA that it was both safe and effective. But what the problem started coming after it was out on the market, and discussions in the academic spine surgery community began to raise some questions about it. We know that not all medical products stand the test of time, and that sometimes after things are approved and in the marketplace that we discover things that it's not as, in real world practice, that not everything turns out to be as good as we thought it was going to be. And this was one of those examples where there were questions that came out about whether the potential harms were maybe bigger than anticipated, and whether the potential benefit might not be as good as anticipated. And so after a couple of years of discussion of this, a group at Yale University, and the project was called YODA. I can't remember the whole acronym. Y stood for Yale. But anyway, there's a research group at Yale that set up the mechanism that helped convince them to share their raw clinical trial data. Now, this had been shared with the FDA, but it had not been shared with the general public or with the scientific community. And so Medtronic agreed to share their raw clinical trials data with two academic groups, one in England and one in Oregon. And when those groups reviewed the data and reanalyzed it, they both came to the conclusion that, in fact, this device was not nearly as good as it was being touted to be. And sales of the device have dropped off significantly since then. So doing the right thing in this case actually cost Medtronic a lot of money in the short term. They were making $1 billion a year on this device, and now it's something like $600 million a year. It's still a lot of money, but it's a lot less. But they did the right thing, and Medtronic needs to get credit for doing the right thing here. And I believe over the long run, even if this action cost them a bit of money in the short run, I think it will pay off for them in the long run in the form of better trust with the surgical community, among other things. In the diagnostic industry, here's another example of transparency that I'd just like to throw out for thought. We all buy reagents from reagent vendors, mainly the in vitro diagnostic companies. How do our reagent vendors handle lot-to-lot variation? Are they really open with us about discussing the data and the quality questions as they arise, or are they more closed and difficult to deal with? I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to get in trouble here, but I will say that at ARUP Laboratories, we have 1 or 2 reagent vendors that are fantastic to work with. If we bring on a new lot of reagent and we have any concerns at all that arise during our validation of that new lot, the company is very quick to respond. We have a direct line essentially to their scientists, and we can troubleshoot it and take care of the issue quickly and get our assay back online to take care of patients the way we need to. So it works really well with 1 or 2 of our IVD vendors. And unfortunately, we also have a couple of large IVD vendors that we work with who are not as open and who in some cases have denied that they, when we see something that we thought was a problem with the new lot, sometimes they've denied that they made any chemical changes to it from the previous lot, even though it turned out they really had, or things like that. So transparency is really, really important in this area. It has a big impact on patient safety and quality of care. And it's an area that we in the laboratory industry, I think, could really think about. How could we handle this? Now, some of you may actually have gone through the new ISO laboratory certification process, which has a big emphasis on vendor qualification. And so some of you may actually already be taking care of these issues through the vendor qualification process. But anyway, I want to bring it up as an important example of intercompany transparency as having a big impact on quality of care. Okay, so we talked about making internal priority, addressing transparency issues. Let me say just a couple quick words about external accreditation. I don't think I need to say a lot because, again, we in the laboratory industry know about accreditation because we're required to go through these accreditation processes. I've listed on the screen a number of the companies that, a number of the organizations that are CLIA-approved accrediting organizations. At ARUP, we happen to use the CAP lab accreditation program. I'm not throwing that as an advertisement, but just to say that's the one I'm personally the most familiar with. One of the roles of accreditation here is to enhance trust across the entire industry, because if an objective third party accredits you as doing what you say you do, that just carries more weight. It keeps us honest. It enhances trust. It allows someone else an added level of trust to say, I know you do what you say you do because this third-party accrediting organization confirmed it. So that plays a really important role. Now, I ran across this paper, a working paper from a Harvard Business School professor recently. This is outside the lab industry. This is actually back to the industrial chemical industry. Actually, it's beyond the chemical industry, but it's an ISO standard that has to do with pollution and environmental responsibility. And this ISO standard requires certified entities to have third-party accreditation of their pollution. It makes sense. And not surprisingly, this professor was able to measure through publicly available data that companies that adopted this ISO standard and therefore had to have third-party monitoring reduce their toxic emissions more than non-adopters. Maybe that sounds really obvious, but it's the paper itself gets into all the different mechanisms by which this takes place, and I think it just reinforces the important role of accrediting agencies in dealing with non-financial measures. Okay, so internal priority, transparency, accreditation. Now we're to supply chain. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is the mechanism by which organizations can hold other organizations accountable for non-financial kinds of things, such as ethical principles. Let me give a couple examples outside the lab industry, outside the healthcare industry. This was from a New York Times article about 2 years ago, and it's a picture of a seafood processor in New Orleans. And what happened here was the seafood processor got caught using what amounted to immigrant undocumented immigrant slave labor. You let people sneak across the border, you make them work 18-hour shifts under unsafe conditions, and you threaten them with deportation if they don't comply or if they speak up, that kind of thing. So over the short run, this hapless seafood supplier was able to get away with this clearly illegal and inhuman activity and boost their profit margins because they didn't have to pay their folks as much as if they were following the law. But those things don't last forever, and they got caught. What was the interesting part of this story to me, the most interesting part to me, was within a day of this news article appearing in the New York Times, their largest customer, Walmart, cut them off as a supplier. So think about that for a minute. Walmart did not own this supplier. Walmart could credibly say in the news, hey, it's not our fault. They're not us. We just buy their fish. They're not our employees. If they were our employees, we never would have been doing that. But Walmart went beyond that. Walmart knew that even though these weren't Walmart employees, they knew that there were huge reputational risks if they were known to be doing business with a company that treats their employees like this. And so Walmart had a business case for using their enormous work purchasing power to enforce an ethical principle. Let me repeat that again. Walmart is famous in the world of business for having enormous purchasing power, and they use that purchasing power to drive down prices all the time. That's what they advertise. That's what they're famous for. That's their business model, is drive down prices partly by using their enormous purchasing power to do so, and it works. But this is an example of Walmart also using their enormous purchasing power to enforce an ethical principle, which is if you're going to be a supplier of Walmart, you have to follow the law, and you can't abuse your employees. So think about that. Next time you're in a contract negotiation with a supplier, you're going to use whatever purchasing power you happen to have in your organization to try to get a good price. You can also use your negotiating leverage to try to enforce other principles that might be important to your organization. Now, the other thing I love about this example of using Walmart is that no one in the world can accuse Walmart of being a crunchy granola organization. I was thinking of using Starbucks or Timberland as my corporate example here, but those sort of have a reputation of being a little bit more, crunchy, left-leaning. No one's going to accuse Walmart of being left-leaning. This is the most capitalist company in the entire world, and yet the principle still applies here. And we can apply it in our industry as well. Here's sort of an interesting example I ran across from the healthcare industry. Kaiser Permanente, like Walmart, is a big organization. It may not be quite as big as Walmart, but it's a big organization with a lot of purchasing power. Kaiser Permanente has apparently decided at a corporate level that it cares about environmental sustainability, and they've probably, I'm sure, I don't know the details, but I'm sure there are internal efforts to, to reduce the waste stream and carbon footprint, things like that. But this is an interesting thing on the supply chain side. Any supplier, as I understand it, who wants to do business, wants to sell medical products to Kaiser Permanente, has to, as part of that process, has to fill out a spreadsheet related to the environmental impact of your organization. So if you're going to sell, I don't know, surgical sponges to Kaiser Permanente, they don't just want to talk about the price of it. They also want to know, okay, what's the carbon footprint of your surgical sponge factory? I think that's really interesting. And it's something, and it's an example of how you can use supply chain for these non-financial, to influence these non-financial things. So how could this apply in the laboratory industry? Well, who is your supply chain as a laboratory? Two big categories that come immediately to mind are your referral labs and your reagent vendors. On the referral lab side, what expectations do you have of your referral lab beyond cost? I mean, obviously you need affordable prices, but do you have additional expectations of your referral lab? Do you expect your referral lab to adhere to quality standards? Well, obviously we all do, and that's why we only refer to, accredited, inspected referral laboratories. But what about principles beyond that? How about if you're referring out to a laboratory that's in the has the practice of inventing new panels of things? Do you care whether whether those panels are clinically validated? Do you care whether there's good science behind them? In principle, you could ask your referral labs to share clinical validation data with you and to be transparent with things like that. On the IVD side, we talked about that a few minutes ago, but if you're doing a contract with the reagent vendor, that might be an opportunity to set up expectations for transparency around certain quality control kinds of things. Okay, so talked about internal priority, transparency, external accreditation, supply chain. Just a couple words about regulatory. And this gets into my personal opinions here, so just take it in that spirit. I believe that the most powerful role of a regulatory organization in this kind of a picture is to set itself up as being complementary to these other elements. On one hand, regulatory agencies have the force of law behind them, and so they have more teeth to enforce things. But if we were to delegate all of our medical ethical expectations to enforcement by the regulatory agencies, they would get overwhelmed and they couldn't possibly handle it all. So I think the healthcare world is going to be a much better place if we have a good interplay between these agencies. Now, things that regulatory organizations can do to enhance this dynamic. Number one, mandating accreditation. We already have that in the lab industry in the form of CLIA requiring accreditation. I think that's a good thing. Mandating transparency. It's not enough, in my opinion, for the FDA to require that it receive validation in clinical trials data. I think that the FDA could go farther to require more public transparency of the same data so that other organizations can hold each other accountable, and we can make this a more interesting picture. That's the example of the Medtronic recombinant bone growth hormone thing. And then finally, preventing monopolies may feel like an anomalous item on this list. But with healthcare organization consolidation going on, and there's a lot of consolidation going on, there is some risk of forming some either monopolies or oligopolies. And the problem there is that if you're the only game in town, you can sort of set the rules for yourself as to how you want to behave, and you have less accountability between different organizations. So preventing monopolies, which is more of an FTC kind of thing, is actually important to this picture as well. Okay, so trying to wrap this up a little bit, key ideas, key suggestions for laboratories. Number one, if you don't already have one, I think having a codified internal code of ethics is an enormously powerful tool. I think within my own organization, ARUP, if you talk to most people here, I think you'll get a strong sense that having our 5 pillars well codified is seen as a very positive thing that enhances communication among all levels of the company. Secondly, give some thought to transparency. In what ways are you transparent with your stakeholders? In what ways are your vendors transparent with you? And are there opportunities to increase that? Things like method validations, clinical studies. These are areas where there may be fruitful opportunities for increased transparency. Third, acknowledge and continue, as we already do, to work to strengthen accreditation systems. I love the fact that the CAP lab accreditation program is a collaborative kind of a program where there's continuous feedback and suggestions and improvement over time. It's the kind of dynamic improvement that you couldn't really have if that program were a statutory government-run kind of a thing. So accreditation systems are we need to appreciate their value and continue to improve and support them. And then finally, the big category for laboratories is take a hard look at your supply chain. What do you expect of your vendors, and how can you work to strengthen the accountability to meet those expectations? So in conclusion, this is my last slide. Healthcare corporations really do need to be held accountable to medical and scientific ethics. It's not enough to hold individuals accountable. We need to hold the whole organizations accountable. There are successful models that are out there. The examples are growing in the business literature. A disproportionate share of these are in areas like environmental responsibility or labor workers' rights responsibilities. And we in the healthcare industry, and more narrowly, those of us in the laboratory industry, can learn from these things, and we can adapt these and apply them. And I think that it'll have a big positive impact on patients in the long run.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your insightful and provocative presentation on our role related to medical ethics. I'm confident you've left our audience with much to consider regarding the healthcare provider's responsibility in closing the gap between the economic realities of our industry and the need for adding true value to the patient experience. On behalf of Dr. Jackson, ARUP Laboratories, and its Institute for Learning would like to thank you for listening to this video lecture.